Writer, director, and comic book creator Mark Evanier didn't emerge from the womb wanting to be a writer of action, dialogue, and the whole 9 yards, but it was a near thing. By the time he was in kindergarten, he was already a precocious reader and the author of a picture book that artfully plagiarized Dr. Seuss, although Mark was too young to know what plagiarism even was. By the time he was 17 and out of high school, he was writing for magazines. Comic books, live-action variety shows, and sitcoms soon followed, and by the late 1970s, Mark had overcome Joe Barbera's prejudice regarding live-action scribes penning episodes of Scooby-Doo, maybe because of Mr. Evanier's history of penning Scooby's adventures in comic book form. Mark has gone on to a lengthy career in animation in general, and of Garfield episodics in particular, penning hundreds of half-hours of The Pizza-Loving Cat over the last 3 decades. He is now at work on the 4th season of a new round of Garfields, which are seen around the world. We talked at the Animation Guild on May 21st, 2012. So, Mr. Evanier.
Yes.
You were born in Santa Monica in 1952, and when did you realize and decide that the writer's life was a life for you?
The doctor slapped me when I was born, and I dropped my word processor. I just always know I want to be a writer.
Would have been an Olivetti in 1952.
I was ahead of my time.
So, but you knew from the time you were in elementary school that was kind of where you wanted to go?
When I was in kindergarten, I wrote a children's book. It was a shameful plagiarism from Dr. Seuss. But as I later learned, some people made some very good money plagiarizing Dr. Seuss. You could have a great career doing that. No, we had. I was reading Dr. Seuss books. I was reading at a very early age, and one day in elementary school at Westler Elementary, they passed out construction paper and crayons for what was supposed to be drawing, and I wrote a children's book that was basically. The plot was basically the 500 hats of Bartholomew Cubbins rolled into one. And
did you illustrate it yourself?
I illustrated
as well?
it myself, yes, and I drew almost as well then as I do now. And the teacher snapped it up and went, "Oh my God, you're not supposed to be able to write in this kind of thing at this age." And they took it up to the principal, and the next thing I knew, I was skipping grades, and they were hailing me as a boy prodigy.
Because you had been reading for quite
I'd been reading
before that.
Dr. Seuss books. I've been reading comic books, a lot of comic books. And in fact, I was speaking with an exclamation point at the end of every sentence I said. And I skipped some grades, and my identity was that's the kid who can write. That's the kid who wrote and was writing a book.
So from the time you were in kindergarten, you were the kid that could write.
So I just went, oh, okay, yeah, I enjoy doing that. I'll do that. And people would say to me when I was a small child, "So, Mark, what do you want to be when you grow up? You want to be a fireman? Do you want to be an astronaut?" And I would say, "I want to be a writer." And they go, "Oh."
Embarrassed silence.
Yeah, it was kind of like, "You're so sure of that?" "Yeah, I'm sure of that." I've never deviated from that.
So
I wasn't sure what I wanted to be a writer of. And there were times when I thought maybe I'll be a writer-artist. I'll do some drawing, and maybe I'll be a writer.
Yeah.
But basically, it was just writing my whole life.
Yeah. And so you probably wrote up a storm all through middle school or junior high school and high school. And so you said that when you were 17, you turned pro.
Yes, yeah.
And you...
Yeah, I got out of high school in 1969. And I took a week or two off, and I went to the newsstand. I had this idea that I wanted to write for someone local. At that time, you could submit stuff by mail, as you still can, to magazines. I just had the idea that I wanted to have an editor face-to-face somehow. So I went to the newsstand up in Hollywood, on Cahuenga and Hollywood, and I went through news magazines, and I was looking for magazines that were produced out of Los Angeles. At that time, the Laugh-In TV show was very big, and there was a magazine called Laugh-In Magazine. It was produced by a company called Laufer Publishing. I looked at it, and the address was 1818 North Highland, within walking distance of where I was at that moment.
That very stand.
Right. So I took Laugh-In Magazine home, and I wrote like 6 articles in one evening for it, because it was very short, little simple. It was basically a Mad Magazine ripoff, in the grand tradition of Mad Magazine ripoffs, which has continued to this day.
Cracked.
And I wrote 6 articles that I thought would fit the magazine that
Yeah.
night on my little Olivetti Underwood typewriter, which my mother had gotten with blue chip stamps, blue chips trading stamps. And the next morning, I took the bus.
And you lived in Hollywood.
I lived in West L.A. I tell people I made the long, hard struggle to Hollywood all the way from West Los Angeles.
Oh, I see.
Yes, you know. Other people come from Kansas. I came from like Olympic and Beverly Lynn. So I took the bus into Hollywood and walked up to 1818 North Highland. I was very scared, and I finally steeled up my courage, and I went up to the offices of Laugh-In Magazine. I went to the secretary, and I said, "I'd like to see the editor of Laugh-In Magazine." And she said, "What about?" And I said, "Well, I'm a struggling young comedy writer. I thought that'd be kind of self-deprecating and funny, and I'd like to sell him some articles." And so she, without missing a beat, went on the phone and said, "George, we have a struggling young comedy writer here who wants to sell you some articles." And I heard him say, "Tell him if he comes back in an hour, I'll give him all the time he wants." She said, "Come back in an hour, he'll give you all the time he wants." So I went out and
Dawdled around for an hour.
got a slice of pizza at the stand at Hollywood Boulevard in Las Palmas, which is still there.
Yeah.
Pizza stand. And I went back, and I walked out of his office with a check for $900.
Wow. He
And
just looked at them right there and
He looked
and cut a
at the
check.
6 articles, and he said, "I want this one, this one, and this one. I don't want this one. I don't like this one." It was actually very brief, but very good criticism. He told me why he didn't like the 3 that he didn't like, and that
What were his reasons? Do you remember?
one of them was too similar to something else he had in works, and one of them was, this is just, you're really reaching for a premise. That was the thing. He says, you're really, all these articles are kind of like what if, or, and, you're really straining. It's a forced premise.
But he liked the other 3.
He liked the other 3 enough to buy them. And I had good timing because he had just taken over as editor. They had changed editors. He was new there. And he needed to build up a repertory of writers and people. And he didn't want to write the stuff himself, and he had a budget. And so I left with more money than my father was making in his job at the time.
So did you become a sort of a permanent stringer for Laugh-In Magazine?
Well,
for a while?
as it happens, the magazine went out of business right after that. They only printed a few.
And the checks didn't bounce.
No. The company was actually. I actually worked for the company on their other magazines for a little while. They were publishing teen magazines and such. They published. I ghost wrote some pieces for David Cassidy, who was big at the time, and I'd
Right.
gone to high school with David Cassidy, although I barely knew him there. I just worked for the company, for a little bit, and I met a few other writers who were working for them, and they referred me to other things. I should preface this by saying that while I was still in high school, I did make kind of a half-assed attempt to write comic books professionally, because I was reading comic books all my life. I had tons of them, and I was writing letters to the editor
Yeah.
a lot. I had a lot of letters printed in the letter pages of comic books. To this day, when I meet people at the Comic-Con, people say, "Oh, I remember you from those letters you had in the comics." And what else have you done? It's like
Right. You missed all the rest of it.
Yeah, it's so. And 3 different editors who I was corresponding with all asked me to submit material to them to write for comic books. And it was a very strange thing. A man named Mort Weisinger was editing the Superman comics. I was writing a lot of letters in. And unbeknownst to me, at the time, Mort Weisinger was having kind of a purge going on at the DC offices, DC Comics offices, where a lot of the old-time writers were banding together to demand health insurance and pensions.
The
and,
in-grades.
yeah, and they were being ousted. So Weisinger was looking for new kids to write his comic books. So he thought my letters were articulate, and he asked me to write some comics, and I submitted a few to him, and finally he came up with one that he really liked. And he said, "I'm going away on vacation. When I get back, I'll give you some notes on this to do a rewrite. And if you can't do the rewrite, I'll do it. But, he said, he ended it saying, congratulations on your first sale." And that was the last I ever heard from Mort Weisinger. He left the company shortly after
Oh,
that.
but they
In the
did buy
meantime,
it.
an editor named Jack Miller, they didn't buy it.
Oh, they
DC didn't buy it.
So he was lying about the sale.
He intended to buy it, but he was out before he could have done
The
it.
sale could be consummated.
That's right. He didn't leave the company, but he left that title. It was a script for Superboy, and they gave Superboy to another editor, and whatever it was, I just never heard from him again. So then, meanwhile, there was an editor there at DC named Jack Miller,
Yeah.
and Jack Miller asked me to write some stuff for him, and I submitted something to him, and he wrote me back that he loved this script, and he was going to pass it on. He said, I'm being replaced on that title by another editor, and I'm going to recommend he buy this script.
Yeah.
And that was the last I ever heard of Jack Miller or that script. And then an editor at Charlton Comics named Dick Giordano asked me to write a ghost story stuff for him, and I submitted a ghost story for Ghostly Tales, and he wrote back to me and said, this is great, I like this script, however, unfortunately, I'm leaving the company. You notice the pattern beginning to emerge here?
Everybody that you make a sale to leaves.
And he said, I'm recommending to my successor that he buy that script. And I never heard anything again on that script, but in the meantime, I heard from Dick Giordano, because he was the guy who replaced Jack Miller at DC.
Right.
And he asked me to write stuff. Anyway, the point was none of these things ever reached fruition. And one of the reasons I wanted to write for an editor locally was it just bothered me that I was like writing for these people I
the
didn't
mail.
know, and I'd send stuff off, and then 3 weeks later I hear back, I'm not here anymore. I felt like I was out of the loop too much to write for them. I said,
Right.
you can't write.
And they were all out of New York.
You can't write
right?
for yeah. And also every time I read an article about the comic book industry at the time, the editors always said, "Oh, you got to live in New York. We can't work with people outside the office. You got to be able to come into the office and have meetings with us." And I wasn't going to be in New York. I didn't want to move to New York.
Yeah.
So I figured, well, I'm never going to work in comics. So I tried these things because they asked me, but they didn't reach any fruition. I thought, well, that's it for me in comics. Comic books will just be something I don't write. So I started writing for Laugh-In magazine, like I said.
Yeah.
And then a week later, I met a man named Jack Kirby, who had moved out here, who was the preeminent comic book artist of the
Marvel, not the DC.
of the industry, practically. I became friends with him, and I got a job through him working for the Marvel fan club that was out here. Marvel had licensed a guy out in L.A. in Culver City to do merchandise of their characters.
So how did you meet Kirby? Was it just through?
We had a comic book club in the late 60s, the L.A. Comic Book Club, which met at Palms Park, Palms Recreation Center, 2950 Overland Avenue in the city of Los Angeles, within walking distance of my home. And every Saturday, we'd all get, a bunch of us, 30 or 40 of us, would get together. It was like a mini Comic-Con. Each week, we'd sell and buy and trade comics. We would sit around and talk about comics. We'd play games. We did the thing, we did game shows with comic books. We would play, the group is called the Los Angeles Comic Book Club, a.k.a. SMASH, S-M-A-S-H. Mm-hmm. That was back during the Man from U.N.C.L.E. era, where everything in the world had to spell something. And we had this, we called ourselves SMASH. We were the Society for Magazine Appreciators of Superheroes. Not the best, not the best match of initials and phrase you could have.
Sometimes acronyms.
And we would play a game called Smash Jeopardy. We'd play the game show Jeopardy, but it would be like categories would be Jack Kirby Inkers and the Tales of Bizarro World and EC Comics, and I was Art Fleming. And we had this big board, and each week we'd play Smash Jeopardy, and the club treasury would give somebody a rare comic book, would buy somebody a rare comic book as the prize, and we had other game shows like that, and we just sit around and debate, whether Spider-Man was better with Steve Ditko or John Romita, or we debate, whether the Spectre looked better.
We had the best approach.
With Neil Adams drawing him as Murphy Anderson, we had these, and sometimes they were very angry debates. Well, I was the president of the club, and there was a science fiction convention at the Hotel Miramar that year. It was a WesterCon. This was before there were any comic book conventions in the state of California. This was July of '69, and the first San Diego Con wasn't until August of 1970.
Yeah.
So a bunch of our members went to the WesterCon. I did not go because I had just sold Laugh-In magazine, that stuff, and I also had a girlfriend who was leaving town, having graduated, and I wanted to spend time with her and write these articles. So I didn't go to the convention. Some of our members did, and Jack Kirby showed up at the convention.
Oh, okay.
He and his wife Roz had just moved to Southern California. Jack had this idea that he wanted to start some sort of a studio where young comic book artists he could train and work with. And the science fiction convention seemed like an interesting place to meet them. So Jack and Roz, they weren't guests at the convention. Jack and Roz went to the convention,
just showed up.
paid the admission price, went in, and all of a sudden the convention was abuzz. This, my God, Jack Kirby is here. None of our guys had ever met anybody who did comic books. I think they'd met Sergio Aragona. Sergio had been a guest speaker at one of our meetings. I had met a couple of guys who did comic books, including Jerry Siegel and Bob Kane.
Right.
But there was Jack Kirby, and these our secretary and treasurer went up to him and introduced themselves and talked to him, and they asked him to come to a meeting as a guest speaker. And he said, "Oh, why don't you come down to our house and and visit?" So our secretary, who was a fellow named treasurer named Rob Solomon, and our treasurer, who was a fellow named Mike Rotblatt, and another guy named Bruce Schweiger, who was on our board. The three of them arranged to go down and visit Jack Kirby, and they took me along. Jack and his wife were living down in Irvine, California. And we went down there, and my life abounds in strange coincidences. What happened was that day, again, I didn't drive at the time. I was supposed to I took the bus down to meet Rob, and Mike, and Bruce, and Mike's mother, who was going to drive us to Irvine. And on the way down, I stopped at the newsstand and bought the new comics that had come out that day. And one of them was the first Marvels of the month, and it had an ad for this thing called Marvel Mania International, this fan club. And the address was in Culver City.
Close by.
Well, closer than I thought. So I went into a payphone at the corner of Robertson and Aerodrome. I don't know why I remember these things. And I called information, and I asked for Marvel Mania International, and they connected me. And this man answered, and I said, "Hi, I'm the president of the local comic book club. I thought I'd find out about your organization, and our club members want to buy your posters you're selling, and we'd like to know more about this." And he said, "Great, we wanted to meet the local fans. We haven't met any comic book fans. Why don't you come by the office right now?" And I said, "Well, I'm on my way to meet Jack Kirby." He said, "Oh, great, give Jack my best, and you come by tomorrow." I said, "Okay, where are your offices?" Now, the mailing address was in Culver City, about 3 miles away. That was amazing that it was that close. The offices were about 6 blocks from where I was, the phone booth, literally.
So you could walk.
I could have,
You didn't have to have somebody's mother drive you.
So that day we drove down to Irvine and met Jack, and I said to him, "I'm going tomorrow to meet this guy who runs Marvel Mania International." And Jack said, "Oh, God, he needs someone who knows the comics. You know the comics, young man." Because one of the things Jack was impressed with was that I knew a lot about how the comics were made and who did them. And in fact, here's a bizarre story here.
How did you know
I've been
all
reading
this stuff?
fanzines. I've been reading comic books. I've been reading fanzines. And
So
I
you were doing
absorbed it all.
research all this
Well, I
time.
just absorbed it all. And it was not because I thought I was going to work in the field, because I didn't. I just was fascinated by it. The fellow who I mentioned, our secretary, was named Robert Solomon.
Yeah.
So when we met Jack, we introduced ourselves by name. I'm Mark Evanier. Nice to meet you. I'm Bruce Schweiger. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. And he said, and Rob Solomon said, "Hi, I'm Robert Solomon." And Jack said to him, "It's your fault. You hired him." And Rob went, "Huh?" And Jack was like, it was like Jack was enjoying a joke that we didn't understand. He said, "You're the one who hired him. It's all your fault." And I went, what is it? And Rob is in high school. Rob never hired anybody. And we were thinking, what does this mean?
What's he talking about?
What's he talking about? And my mind just raced for this. And I remembered that in comic books they had these things called the Statement of Ownership, where each year they would print this little thing that said who owned the company and how many copies they sold. And in a lot of the old Marvels, not the recent ones, the old ones, it said treasurer of the company, Robert Solomon. That was the name of the guy who was the treasurer in the business office of Marvel Comics.
Back east, probably.
Back east. No relation to my Robert Solomon. And I finally put the two and two together, and I said, Robert Solomon hired Stan Lee. And Jack went, "Yeah, that's right. The guy who hired Stan Lee at Marvel Comics in 1941 was named Robert Solomon. My friend had the same name."
Another
And
coincidence.
Jack was so impressed that I made that connection and knew that. He said to me, "My God, young man, you know comics like nobody knows this stuff like you do." And then as we sat there talking with him, interviewing him for our fanzine, every so often he'd say, "Yeah, and so Martin Goodman did this," and my friends would look blank, and I go, "Oh, Martin Goodman, publisher of Marvel." And Jack, "Oh, you know those guys." And Jack would say, and so then there was this artist who was drawing the Black Knight for Marvel. I don't know his name. And I said, "Joe Maneely." He'd go, "Oh, yes, you know this stuff." And so then he recommended me to Marvel Mania. He called the guy at Marvel Mania and said, "Hire this kid. He knows Marvel Comics back. You need someone who knows the comics if you're going to be selling."
Backwards and forwards.
Yes. So this guy, the next day I went to see this man at the Marvel Mania place, and he hired me. And I was
Wow.
suddenly working for the Marvel fan club. And
And was it the Marvel fan club that then was the next step in was to start writing?
no,
for
well, the next step
comic
was
books?
that Jack left Marvel.
Yeah.
And he hired a fellow named Steve Sherman, who also worked at Marvel Mania, and myself to be his assistants. And I had not ever, like I said, I never planned to work in comic books. I was as surprised as anybody, but all of a sudden I was Jack's assistant. And that opened doors. That credit meant a lot to people. And because of that, I had met a fellow named Mike Royer, who was a comic book artist, another professional. He was working for Russ Manning, assisting him on the Tarzan newspaper strips, and he was also working for Gold Key Comics.
Right.
And for some reason, and I have no idea what this is, it had never dawned on me to write for Gold Key Comics. They were in Los Angeles. They had an office that I had driven. The old office had been on Santa Monica Boulevard near Wilshire.
Yeah.
And I knew that my parents would drive me by it. I go, "That's where the comic books come from. That's where Dell Comics come from." And then later their office had moved. I didn't know where, but I knew they were still local because Mike was working for them. And it had never dawned on me to write for them. Well, Mike.
You didn't follow your own muse, which was write for a local.
Well, but I
locally-based
had kind of written comic books off as a
Oh.
career. So I asked Mike about writing for Gold Key Comics. That Western was now called Gold Key.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said, "Oh, you know what you could do? The Disney studio has a program where they write comic books in-house
Yeah.
for the overseas market. And they asked me to write some of those. And I had been trying to help Mike get the job of being Jack Kirby's inker on his comic books for DC, because I thought he was better than the guy that New York had picked out, and also he was local, and also he was my friend Mike. So Mike said, "If I'm going to get this Jack Kirby job, I'm not going to have time to do stuff for Disney. Why don't you do something?" He recommended me to the Disney people,
Oh,
and I
okay.
started writing Disney comics for them, for the foreign Disney market.
These were the Gold Key comics.
No, these were the ones only printed overseas. Gold Key edited a batch of comics, and then the reprint rights to those were sold around the world. But the foreign countries needed more quantitatively than Gold Key was producing, so the publications department at Disney would commission another couple hundred pages a month of comic book material, only to appear overseas. And I started writing those. I was writing for a man named George Sherman, who was the head of the publications department there at Disney at the time, a very nice man, and he liked my scripts, but he was very ill. He was out a lot for medical reasons, and when he'd come back to work, there'd be the script, his desk would be piled high with Evan Ayre scripts.
Even then, you were prolific.
Yes. So the
Well, how many scripts were you writing week to week? Of
3 or 4 a week,
3 or 4 weeks, and how long were each of the scripts?
6 or 7 pages.
And
I
they
mean,
were-
I could write one in one sitting.
And they were all formatted. They were basically dialogue description,
Yeah.
dialogue description.
So the editor of Gold Key Comics was a man named Chase Craig. And I had not approached Chase Craig because another comic book artist I know named Alex Toth hated him, and he told me, "Oh, Chase Craig is the worst editor in the world. You'd hate him. He cheats you. He lies you. He doesn't know it's just demonizing the guy."
Bad mouth.
And that scared me off. So Chase one day was talking to George Sherman, saying, "Oh, one of my best writers just died or left me, whatever it was. I'm short-handed of writers." And George said, "Hey, there's this kid named Evan Ayre who's been writing really good stuff for us we like. Let me send you some of his scripts So George sent over 3 or 4 of the scripts I'd done for him, and Chase liked them, and he called me and said, "Can you do that for me?" And what I did was I sold Chase the stories George had rejected, and then later on, when I wrote for Chase, I sold George the stories Chase rejected.
Well, that's smart.
Yes,
Efficient.
yes, that's right. And
What was your batting average for each? About 50-50 or 70-30?
no, actually, I probably sold. Well, on the Disney stuff, I sold 100%. I think I sold 100% of everything I wrote at Disney.
Well, then there's
because
nothing to
I
be
sold
rejected that you can
yeah,
sell to the
no,
other
I
guy.
sold 80% to George, and the other 20 I sold to Chase. And then when I was writing for Disney stuff for Chase, I sold 80% to him, and I sold the other 20% to George. Well, then Chase asked me if I wanted to write Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and the other things he was doing. And even though that was more problematic because I had no other place to sell those rejects, I liked the Bugs Bunny characters better, and I started writing Bugs Bunny for Chase. And I woke up one morning, and I was writing Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, Daffy Duck, the Roadrunner, Woody Woodpecker, Super Goof, the Beagle Boys, the Pink Panther.
So you're writing animation in a comic book format.
Yeah, I was writing, basically, my understanding with Chase was to write a book a week of something. That was kind of our understanding.
Did they leave you to pretty much concoct what you wanted to concoct, or did they say, no, go this way?
He
go
would
that
say
way?
to me, this issue of Daffy Duck, I want to do 4 6-page stories, and try to get Elmer Fudd into one of them, and try to get Bugs into one of them, or something like that.
But he didn't give you a lot of
No,
hard and fast
no,
rules.
No, and so I wrote for 2 or 3 years. I wrote stuff for him, and I wrote took over the Scooby-Doo comic book, which I wrote, which a man named Dan Spiegel drew, who was one of my favorite artists when I was growing up. I'll tell you.
This is all in the early 70s,
Yeah, this is
right?
this all in the early 70s. I'll tell you how far back I go as a Dan Spiegel fan. The first movie I ever remember seeing when I was a kid, my parents took me to lots of movies. You don't remember the ones you saw when you were 3. The first one I was cognizant of remembering seeing was Don't Give Up the Ship, starring Jerry Lewis, which we saw at, this is the kind of memory I have, we saw at the Paradise Theater on Sepulveda Boulevard. The theater is still there, but now it's an office building. It's on your way out to the LAX, across the street from the In-N-Out Burger is the Paradise. It's still there. And I saw this thing we called Don't Give Up the Ship, and I liked it. The next day, we had an appointment with my pediatrician. I think I was 9 or something like that. And my parents bought me some comic books on the way, including the Dell comic book adaptation of Don't Give Up the Ship. So I'm sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Grossman on Wilshire Boulevard, reading Don't Give Up the Ship, the comic book of Don't Give Up the Ship.
You've
The
just seen
kid
the
next to me says to me, "Hey, did you see that movie?" And I go, "Yeah, it was real neat." He said, "That's my dad." I look at the cover and I say, "Your dad is Jerry Lewis?" And the kid says, "Yeah, that's my dad." And I'm just about to say the 9-year-old equivalent of "you're lying" to him, when the door opens and Jerry Lewis walks in.
He wasn't
It's
lying.
Jerry Lewis to pick up his kid. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Lewis, I just read your comic book." And Jerry Lewis kind of went like, "Yeah, leave me alone, kid." It's just very rude to me. And I didn't actually hold that against him. I thought, "Oh, okay, that's what big stars do, you know." That comic book was drawn by Dan Spiegel, the man who became my partner for 25 years after that. Then one day in 1980, I was writing a variety show with Jerry Lewis on it. And I took the comic book in. Not a copy of the comic book,
same
the exact
comic book.
same physical one that I had in
Because you
19...
keep all of
That's
them.
because I keep all of them, right. And I took it in, and I made him sign it, and I told him the story of how he was rude to me, and he was very apologetic about it. And he looks through the comic book, and he says, "Gee, this is nice. Who drew this?" And I went, "Dan Spiegel. I know the guy." And I'm working with him now. It was just like, this is how it happens. Everything kind of comes together. Everything in
tied
my
up with a
life
bow.
intersects. So Dan Spiegel and I were doing Scooby-Doo comic books, and I did those for a few years, and I got along great with Chase. The moral of the story is, don't listen to Alex Toth. I got along fine with him.
He didn't, but you did.
Yeah, well, he didn't get along with him. I got along great with Chase. He was one of my mentors. He and Jack Kirby were my 2 mentors in comics, and oddly enough, they were both born on August 28th.
Well, maybe that has something to do with
Yeah.
it. Were you, so you were pretty much an exclusive comic book writer. How many pages a week of comic book writing were you doing
I was
Script-wise.
my goal was to write a whole book, so that was like 24 pages a week.
So you're writing 24 pages a week
Yes.
and going right along. And how long were you exclusively just writing in comic books?
Well,
in your
comic
early
books,
career?
well, I was at this point. I was still writing for, magazine articles here and there. I did some of the teen magazine stuff. Every so often, I wrote a couple of very naughty books under other names that were full of physical feats I had yet to experience in my own life.
These are paperbacks?
Yeah, yeah.
So you were writing novels?
I was
too.
writing. Yeah, I was writing just everything that came to me. A little. I don't know. It just things kept seeking me out. But I was going to UCLA for most of the time I was writing for Gold Key, so that was taking up a certain amount of my time. And I was working for Marvel Mania for a while in there. I quit them because they were a crooked operation that didn't pay people and cheated folks.
That's unfortunate.
And I was working with Jack Kirby for some of this period too. I was going on the weekend and
And
working
this
with
is
Jack.
like 70, 71, 72,
Right,
73.
yeah, I was working with Jack on stuff, assisting him on.
And you were an undergrad at UCLA at the
Yeah.
same time?
Yeah, I quit UCLA because I thought I realized one day that I was neglecting my writing work to study anthropology, and I thought to myself, this is not smart. Okay, I'm going to college, essentially go to college to get a better job, not to turn down work. So I quit UCLA.
Was that your second year, third year?
Second year, yeah. I just this was also during a lot of it was the season of protests.
Yeah, yeah.
There was an awful lot of every couple of weeks someone would bomb Cambodia and classes would recess, and it was not a good place to go. And I couldn't get into any English classes. I was taking economics and anthropology and
Stuff that you weren't that interested in.
stuff that I knew would never stay in my mind. There's a certain thing you go through. Like in college, in high school, I had to take chemistry. I had to learn how to balance redox equations. I don't know what a redox equation is. I don't know why you balance them, but I had to learn it. And the minute the final was over,
You forgot it.
I completely forgot. And to this day, I can't tell you a thing. I couldn't tell you 5 minutes after the final.
But you can remember who wrote what
I
comic
can remember
because you
who.
were
I can remember.
engaged.
I can remember that Steve Ditko inked Fantastic Four number 13 and Artie Simek lettered it. Yeah, but I was taking classes at UCLA that I knew were like. I called them redox equations classes.
Yeah, right.
Anthropology was a redox
Study,
equation.
pass the test,
Yes.
move on.
So I thought, well, I'm making too much money writing. I'm turning down too much paying work. And
What did your parents think of you quitting UCLA?
my father hated the idea. So I took a few courses at Santa Monica College just kind of to wean myself off of. I enrolled in SMC and took classes there 2 days a week for a couple hours just as a. So my
Soft to your father.
So my father could still say that I was going to college. And finally, one day, he figured out that I was making a lot more money than he was. And I'd been doing it steadily for 2 or 3 years, and he
Said,
dropped his opposition to that.
Yeah.
But see, my father had the worst job in the world.
What did he do?
He worked for the Internal Revenue Service. He was the man who, if you were in a lot of trouble, would come to you and say, Mr. Hewlett, we have to work out a payment plan. You owe the government, everything.
So he was well loved by the general population.
People hated it. And he was a lovely, wonderful, sweet. He hated his job. He hated doing that to people. He hated the fact that he would, in the morning, his territory was Bel Air and Venice.
Oh, God.
So
yin and yang.
he'd go out to Venice, and there'd be some poor woman whose husband had deserted her, and she owed the government $5,000, and she didn't have $5,000, and the kids couldn't go to school because they didn't have shoes, and my father would have to say to her, here's a payment plan. He worked out a payment, and like a car dealership, he didn't have the power to sign off it. He had to go get his boss to bless it. And he would go to his supervisor at the IRS and say, this woman, here's the payment plan. And the guy would say, no, get her to pay more. And he'd have to come back to her and say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to pay $25 more a week than you already can't afford. Then in the afternoon, he would have a case on some guy who had a $10 million estate in Bel Air. And $10 million estate in Bel Air in 1971 was like
A lot of money.
$50 million estate today. And the guy, he'd walk in, the guy hadn't paid taxes since, the Truman administration. And the guy would have on the wall a picture of himself with Reagan and a picture of himself with Nixon, and my father would go, "This guy is never going to pay a cent." And the guy would be screaming, "I'm a good American, don't hound me." And my father would try to work on a payment plan with him.
And they'd say no.
And this guy would say no, and my father would go to his supervisor, and the supervisor would say, "I just heard from Washington, let him go." This is why.
That's the way the country has always worked.
Yes. My father did not like the idea of paying taxes at all. He didn't think taxes were great. He just felt that
They should be
the
fair.
woman in Venice who couldn't afford to buy shoes for her kids was paying more than she should have because the guy in Bel Air needed another Maserati and didn't want to pay his taxes. At one point, my father, who did not make a lot of money in his job, bought a woman in Venice, shoes for the kids. He was so haunted by the fact these poor kids were barefoot and couldn't go to school because they had no shoes, that he went, and you know what shoes for kids cost. He went to the Stride Rite shoe store, which is a kids' shoe store in West Hollywood, and he basically made a deal with the guy. "I'm going to send this family in. I will pay their bill for the shoes." And the woman went in and bought her kids shoes. On my father's time, which was a big expense for him, but he just was so haunted by this. This is an example of how nice my father was. He bought shoes for a stranger's kids. And a couple of days later, he gets called into the office of the IRS and chewed out. The woman had sent a letter to his supervisor to say what a nice man Bernard Evanier was. And it was kind of like, "You can't do this. Everybody will be expecting the IRS to buy their kids shoes. We got to be tougher on these people." He was almost demoted.
He was chewed
An
out.
act of kindness. So
Did he retire out of that job?
he did retire out of that job, happily in time to watch the Watergate hearings and to hear a lot of that come out. People remember from the Watergate hearings, they remember the big scandals about break-ins and tapes and all that stuff. But lesser attention was paid to the fact that Nixon's personal attorneys were making these deals to, if you give to the committee to reelect the president, you don't have to pay your taxes.
Right. I remember all that.
And a couple of years ago, I was at a lecture that John Dean gave from Watergate, and I went up to him and I thanked him. I said, "You have no idea the happiness you gave my father that stuff came out," because he had testified to a lot of that. It didn't make big headlines, but it was the part of Watergate that probably had the most impact in terms of changing laws, which was that it was no longer possible to, or as possible, to rig someone's taxes if they were your political.
Now, 40 years later, we're sort of back in the mire.
Well, everything old is new again.
Exactly.
So anyway,
moving back to your comic book
my father had, every writer he'd ever met was broke because he only met people. In fact, people who watch this video will probably know the name Bill Littlejohn,
Oh, yeah.
an old animator. Bill Littlejohn was one of the guys my father had to foreclose on.
Yeah.
And years later, when I met Bill Littlejohn, June Foray one day introduced me to Bill Littlejohn, and he said, "Oh, this is Mark Evanier," and Bill Littlejohn went, Evanier, where do I know that? I know an Evanier. Where do I know the name from? And I'm going, "Oh no, it's a very common name. You probably, there's thousands of, it's about 8 of us around. I didn't want him to know that my father was the one who would try
Lowered the boom.
to take his house away. My father also closed down Pacific Ocean Park,
Oh, I
the
remember.
big amusement park out in Santa Monica.
I went there
POP.
as a kid.
My father had to
For back taxes.
For back taxes, he had to close them down. Yeah, that was one.
How long did he work
So
for
it was
the
it was kind of
IRS?
like the other kids at school would say, "I'm going to Pacific Ocean Park," and I go, "My father closed it down." It was the joke used to always be the kids would always say to me, "My dad can beat your dad," and I'd say, "My dad can audit your dad."
And so my dad is more powerful than your
That's
dad.
right. So.
So he did that.
But he retired in time to watch the Watergate here and to see that I was
And to
financially
recognize
solvent.
that his son was one of the successful writers.
Well, yeah, somebody's got to be. Somebody's got to make a living. He just had an enormous fun watching me working and meeting people. Like I would take him out to lunch with Sid Caesar. I'd take him out to lunch with Jonathan Winter. He just couldn't believe that I was working with these people, and that was a big.
So how did
big
you
thing.
get on from, because you're doing comic books in 70, 71, 72, 73. When did you make the transition? Because didn't you transition first into live action
Yeah.
before you transitioned into animation?
Yeah, I wrote comic books for Gold Key for a while. I stopped writing for Disney eventually, just because I had enough other work. I started writing the Tarzan comic books for overseas and
Yeah.
editing for Edgar Rice Burroughs. And then at that point, I was writing some stuff for stand-up comedians. I was go up, you could go up to the Comedy Store. That was the golden era. You'd go up to the Comedy Store and you'd see Richard Pryor and Rodney Dangerfield and Steve Landesberg and a little later, a guy named Jay Leno and a guy named David Letterman. And I started just writing stuff for stand-up comedy. I just go up and hand these guys jokes, and some of them would buy them and stuff like that, or not pay me for
So
them.
you started going to the
Yeah.
Comedy Store and
Yeah.
soliciting or
Just writing
and
stuff.
offering
Yeah,
material.
I just thought it was something I knew I wanted to do, and it was there. And I had the luxury that I didn't need the money because I was making enough money doing comic books. So I didn't have to go in and go, please give me $10 more for a joke. I hated the negotiation part. So I kind of took it off the table. I just kind of said, just pay me whatever you want whenever you feel like it. And you become very popular if you walk into the Comedy Store with essentially free material. So I get a call one day, or a letter, I think it was a letter, from a fellow named Dennis Palumbo, Palumbo, who was a former advertising writer from Pittsburgh, who knew of me because I had written a fan letter to him for a book he'd written on TV history. He was in LA and he was trying to become a TV writer.
Yeah.
And at that time, it's probably less true today, but at that time, young comedy writers always came in pairs. They're all teams. And he realized he needed a partner. And he decided to call me up. We had lunch just out of the whim. We got along. And it turned out we'd been writing for some of the same comedians at the Comedy Store. And
This is 74, 75?
74, 75, yeah. And we became friends. We decided to team up and see how we would get along. And Dennis was much better than I was at calling someone cold to ask for work, pitching ourselves. He was a little better, I shouldn't say a little bit, a lot better at that end of the sales part of the thing. And he was a good writer, too. And within 2 years, we were writing for a lot of sitcoms and a lot of TV shows.
Wow. What were some of your sitcoms and TV shows?
Well, we wrote one of the many pilots for Love Boat. We wrote the McLean Stevenson show. We wrote the Nancy Walker. We wrote the Nancy Walker show. I tell people we got fired after 6 weeks, and Nancy got fired after 8. We wrote a couple of things that never got on the air, and we wrote Welcome Back, Kotter for a year, which was our big, all-consuming. Take every spare minute of your day.
So you stopped doing comic books at that time, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Although I did in the middle of it get hired to write the Welcome Back, Kotter comic book for DC Comics. But I was writing the TV show, and I was writing the comic book, and I had more trouble getting a script through the comic book people than the TV show people.
Really?
Yeah. At one point, the editor of the comic book, I had a joke in my script. This was back when the big thing was Evel Knievel was going to jump the Grand Canyon on a motorcycle. It was a big news story. So I had this joke where Horshack, the character on Kotter, was talking to somebody who was a real loudmouth, pain in the ass character. And he said, "Hey, Evel Knievel just called. He wants to know if he can jump your mouth." So I was on the phone literally in the office of the Kotter offices. I was sitting in the waiting room on the phone to this editor in New York. And he said to me, "See, that's out of character. Horshack wouldn't say that." And just as he said that, Ron Palillo, who played Horshack, walks past me. I said, "Hold on a second." And I stopped and I said, "Ron, here's the joke." I told him the line. And he goes, "Oh, I love that. I want that in the script. Can we put that in the script this week? I love that." I said, "Okay, we'll cut it out of the comic book script since you say." And it was heard on TV,
But not in the comic.
but not in the comic book because it was out of character. This is when you learn not to take
It's all subjective.
editors that seriously. Everybody has thousands of stories like that if they do this stuff. So I didn't do many comic books while I was doing Kotter. And then, okay, now here, are you ready for another one of those coincidences? All right. There was a lady who worked on Kotter who was one of the classroom extras. Her name was Christine.
Right.
I decided at the end of the first season, after our first season, Dennis and I decided we were going to split up the team because we had different career goals. We parted friends. We're still good friends. And I decided I didn't want to go back to Kotter. that I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I said, I don't want to do that anymore. It's too much trouble.
This was season 1?
This was the season 2. So the wrap party for that season was essentially my swan song at Cotter. So Christine was, like I said, classmate. So she went to the wrap party, and we had kept our relationship secret on the show because she didn't want people to think that she was on the show because she was sleeping with one of the writers. Even though she was hired on the show before I was, people think this kind of thing. So we go home after the wrap party, and the next morning we wake up, and I said I was unemployed. For the first time in my professional career, I was unemployed because Cotter was over and I had nothing else to do. And she said to me, well, if you could do anything in your life, what would you want to do? And I said, I don't know. It's too big a question. She said, well, if you could have back any job you had in the past, which would that wasn't hard because I hadn't done that many jobs. So I thought, well, the thing I always loved doing, for a year and a half there, so I wrote the Scooby-Doo comic book for Gold Key. It was an editor named Chase Craig, and he was wonderful. And it was drawn by a man named Dan Spiegel, who was my favorite artist I ever worked with. And I really wish I could go back and do that. She says, why can't you go back and do that? I said, well, for one thing, Chase Craig is retired. He doesn't work anymore. He's no longer an editor. For another thing, Gold Key no longer does Scooby-Doo comic books. For another thing, Dan Spiegel's under contract to DC Comics now. So I can't get the editor I want. I can't get the assignment I want. I can't get the company I want. I can't get the artist I want. She was okay. 15 minutes later, the phone rings. It's Chase Craig calling to say he's out of retirement. He's editing a new line of Scooby-Doo comic books for Hanna-Barbera, and Dan Spiegel's going to draw them when I like to write them.
All right. So obviously your girlfriend was a witch.
Yeah. So that afternoon, Chase said to me, are you free for lunch? I said, yeah. So that afternoon, I was writing Scooby-Doo comic books.
So you were unemployed for what, a day?
6 hours. 7 hours. Okay. Now, since I've told that story, that's one of those Twilight Zone, it can't be true stories. Here's a bigger one. Christine's name was Christine Greco. We went out for a couple years. During this period of time, I was a collector of old comedy records. I still have every old comedy record ever done. I was a huge fan of Spike Jones.
Yeah, Spike was great.
So I thought, nobody had written a book on Spike Jones. I had met a couple of people who worked with Spike Jones, and I thought, maybe I'll write a book on Spike Jones. I looked around, I talked to a publisher I knew, and he said, nobody's able to write a book about Spike Jones because the family doesn't want to cooperate and there's not enough material for a book without access to his personal papers and such like that. I said, well, maybe someday I'll come across that. So one day, Christine and I go to a movie in Westwood Village. I even remember what the movie was. It was Donna Floor and Her Two Husbands. I annotate all these things with completely useless trivia that I remember.
Well, we go back. You have a mind that never forgets anything.
Well, yeah, we go back to her place, and as we're walking into her apartment, I said, "Oh, I was thinking, I'm thinking of writing a book about. I don't know if you heard of him. There's this old band leader named Spike Jones." She said, "Oh, you mean Uncle Spike?" I said, "What do you mean, Uncle Spike?" She said, "Spike Jones is my uncle. Didn't you know that?"
Right.
I said,
"It's never come up."
Her name was Christine Greco. Her aunt was Helen Greco, Spike's wife. Helen Greco had Americanized her name from Greco to Greco. I said to her, "You never told me," she said, "Yeah, I'm Spike Jones' niece. I even sung on some of his records. I'm part of the Spike Jones family." I said, "Where are all of Spike Jones' personal papers and effects?" She says, "They're in my garage. Your car's parked next to them."
You just had never brought up Spike Jones.
Wait, it gets weirder. I swear to you, this is an absolutely true story that nobody believes. All right, I go out to back to the garage. There's these boxes, these bankers' boxes full of stuff. I park next to them every time I was over there for the last 2-3 years. I take the lid off a box, and there's animation storyboard drawings. The boxes are full of Spike Jones sheet music and memorabilia and souvenirs and gifts he used to give out to car. Gifts he used to give out to disc jockeys. I still have a lot of this stuff she gave me. But the box I opened was full of animation-style storyboards where Spike had hired cartoonists to draw gags that he would do live action on his TV show. He hired animators to do gags for live action. The top drawings on there at the time, I picked them up, and the top drawings were done by Tex Avery. Now, there were other gags in there. Some of them looked like They were done by Virgil Part, the great magazine cartoonist, and some of them I couldn't recognize who they were by.
Price was a good friend of my father's.
Okay, so she gives me these drawings. She says, here, they're yours, take them. Really? So the next month, following Monday, I take them into my office at Hanna-Barbera. I was working for Hanna-Barbera at this time. I take them in to show them to my roommate, Tex Avery. I was sharing an office with Tex. He was sitting there with an old guy, I didn't know who it was, and Tex did a Tex Avery take when he saw these. And he said, my God, 10 minutes, we were just talking about writing for Spike. And he remembered the gags, and he remembered, no, remember that, yes. So I showed him the other drawings. I said, now, who did these other drawings? The ones I couldn't identify. He said, oh, that's Roy Williams. Remember Roy Williams?
Yeah, Roy Williams, the big musketeer.
Right, yeah. Buried next to Earl Kress at the Forest Lawn Cemetery. Anyway. And I said, now, these drawings look like they were by Virgil Parch. And he turns to the man he was sitting with. He says, Virgil, you recognize these? It was Virgil Parch was sitting there.